Dear Richard, you are one of my 5 laureates of the Global Award for Sustainable Architecture this year, in 2021. Thank you so much for your persistent work towards a theory of architecture and the city necessary for societies today. Since your work for UN Habitat, you have developed very concretely a development towards new goals.
I had quite a shock when I began working seriously on architectural questions for the United Nations, which was about 18, 20 years ago. Before then, I had been, as a professional, been involved with the social and political sides of urban life. And then I became, when I went to work for UN, with UN Habitat and with World Bank, I was asked to translate more questions, particularly social questions about urban space, about urban life, relation of work to family, and so on, into questions about urban space. And I didn't know how to do that. Happily, I discovered that many of my colleagues also didn't know how to do it. There were few economists in the World Bank who felt easy about that. So over the last 20 years, we've tried to develop programs which link the physical and the social. And that's true in UN Habitat itself. It's become much more a question of this relationship rather than of development as something which is self-standing and so on. How things are made, how they look, are now part of what their purpose is. And that then got very much sharpened when the ecological question became a crisis. And because there will never be a solution to this ecological crisis made by money alone. It's a crisis in built form. And it's very difficult to understand what that would be. We know what it shouldn't be, that the Corbusian sealed glass box has to be broken, open. That the tower is no longer an ecological form. But what should take its place is a real question for the future. And so far to date, most ways in which architects are approaching the question of the climate challenge is in terms of materials specification and flow through buildings of air and heat. But it's at a very low level of integration with how people live. So this work still remains to be done that's the task of a future generation, how new ways of living are going to integrate with new ways of building.
Very remarkable for this year's problematic that I raised, architecture and nature, a new synergy, question mark, is that 4 of our 5 laureates live and work in the global south, in Central and South America. Does this surprise you?
What I have found, which was both positive and negative, was that our colleagues in the Global South are much more attuned to dealing with questions of climate change because they have had to work with nature before. When we began in the United Nations the research on how to deal with climate change, we found a community of architects who are in the Global South, particularly in Latin America, who could teach us rather than had to be acclimated by this. In part, that was a question of just of money, which is that the kinds of extravagant building that occur in places like Germany or the United Kingdom was not so easily available for people in architects working in the South. They had less resources, so they had to be more innovative. But I would say it's also a different conception of the city, which is that the architecture had to enable people to live better in the city rather than creating objects which were objects of regard. A great tragedy to me in this regard was that, you know, I'm very old, so I knew Chinese architects from before the Great Boom and after. And before the Great Boom, during China's poorer period, I would say that they, like our friends in Latin America, were very attuned to dealing with natural world, particularly with questions of heat and of high humidity and also of pollution. But once China was able to access Western forms of architecture, more sealed box, more self-standing objects meant for display, that the kind of urbanistic quality of Chinese architecture degraded. And so it's been for me a kind of case study in this contrast between this integration that you see in Latin America and a deformation and isolation of architecture from the urban context and the natural context, which I think is more pervasive in Europe. And now the Chinese, of course, are recoiling against this urban world that they made. They want a more integrated, more ecological kind of architecture. And it means pushing out a lot of the bad habits that we as Europeans had about making architectural form.
How will the biggest pandemic in an entire century change the way we live and work in the future? Are we facing the escape of cities and the reconquest of flexible lifestyles in our territories?
The great danger to this is that a temporary measure, which is physical isolation, would be normalized. We can't go back to an age of suburbs, of dispersed spaces. We can't do that because that's anti-ecological. And this is a question about density. We have to make ways to find density to be more flexible so that when there are moments when people do have to isolate, the physical forms that they live in allow that, but that it not be normalized, that the notion is that you live apart. I've been very struck by some very simple things that have been done in Britain to do that, which is to give different times to people in the street so that they, instead of isolating in the house, that there would be, say, mid-morning, only elderly people like myself would be allowed to be on the street, but then they would be allowed. That's to make the form flexible of the street, that is to give it a kind of age grading, so under these extraordinary conditions. But the real danger is that the pandemic would force us backward into the idea that isolation is safety. That's a dreadful thought. And it would be very destructive of dealing with climate change. There is a structural, through the medium of density, there's a structural contradiction between the healthy city and the ecological city, as long as you think in terms of density. So there has to be a more flexible way of dealing with the pandemic than that. And the problem, of course, is transport. And in a way, you know, driving in one person driving in an automobile is very healthy, but it's also very destructive. So, obviously. Whereas mass transit, which is the future for an ecological city, a green city, poses all sorts of questions in this. But the answer to that is not isolation. As an urbanist, what I would say is we have to figure out ways that physical isolation is not social isolation.
Also, Richard, I thank you so much for your stance against the Athens Charters, formulated by Le Corbusier in 1933, which before the eyes of the world distorted the reformist commitment of the German Bauhaus. And its protagonists, you remember well, Walter Gropius, Isi Gropius, Siegfried Gideon, Bruno Taut, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Your reputation and your credibility underlined my battle waged since the beginning of my academic career. This ecological city experienced since 1919 and declared at the Siam 1931 in Zurich was erased when Adolf Hitler in 1933 took power in Germany. The proto-ecological activists of the Bauhaus, for the most part Jewish, and social democrats, of course, had to urgently prepare for their exile following their dismissal and their muzzling, and Le Corbusier in no way took the leadership of the CM in 1933. Where are we today in this situation, in this possible rehabilitation of modern transdisciplinary reformists?
The method of thinking of Corbusier at that period in his life, he changed later, embodies what systems theorists call a closed system. And that is a system in which objects can be, it's additive, objects can be added to the system. You make 5 apartment houses, towers, you could make 50 or 5,000. And it has a tight fit between form and function. That was something that Corbu extended from Gropius and made into a kind of, that everything there is no extraneous form to it. And that is what a closed system is. It's got homogeneous parts, it's additive, you can make more of it. The form doesn't grow by interaction. Whereas an open system, and my book was titled The Open City in German, I don't know why in French it's called this, is something in which the parts interact and they modified by their interaction. So if you put a school here and a hospital here, the form of this interaction, exchange, whatever, just their propinquity to each other, will mean that the architecture becomes, the school looks a little maybe hospital-like, but the hospital looks a little more open like a school. But the principle of an open system is that it's reactive and it's non-predictive, so that by taking a plan, you can't predict what a city will look like in 50 years. A closed system is coherent, and an open system is complex. Coherence tends to be reductive. The open system complexity tends to be messy, informal, doesn't follow a linear path of development. And so that's what I've intended by that kind of, that's the challenge that I would put to the Charter of Athens. The Charter of Athens embodies the city and cities as closed systems.
Richard, do you see, like me, a new generation of architects, town planners, landscapers, les paysagistes, biologists, but of course also sociologists, anthropologists, geographers, psychologists, who are fighting for this new vision, the living space affordable for all and supportable for our planet?
I have found it more rewarding to work with paysagistes than with architects of fixed form. And that is because paysagistes are dealing with things that have a life of their own, they're more manipulable, they cost less, the forms are more adaptable, and so on. And in the COP26 work for the United Nations, the lead designers are paysagistes, not architects of fixed form. And if I were running an architecture school, I would force every architect of a building to first study a plant and a system of plants before designing a city. What we have to abandon is the notion of best practices and look at, which is that there is one best practice which suits a problem. And the way in which we teach is to imagine, and when we work with other people, is to try and imagine alternatives, different ways of solving a problem, each of which has an advantage and a disadvantage. But that there is no one solution to a problem. That's also very open system thinking. And then the question about which of these alternatives you take should be for those who are going to live in the space, not for the planner. We don't have a democratic planning at all. We have things that are presented to the public, but we have very little co-planning, where those who inhabit a space, who have to live with it, are part of its design. It's a rhetoric which is not a reality. So the kind of planning practice that I've developed in the last 20 years is one where people who have skills, social or visual, will generate alternative plans and then disappear. Which is to say that exit is as important in the planning process as entrée, and that the final decisions should not be planners. It's my problem with the 15-minute city. That's a planner's notion of sustainability. It's impossible to practice because the plan doesn't allow for people to make their own decisions about whether they want to do that or not. There's some communities in which the notion of being able to be far away from home is a form of freedom. If you're a poor immigrant, a 15-minute city means you're in a ghetto, you know? So anyhow, it's an example of, you know, this kind of narrowness of this. So I think to make planning process more democratic. We have to redefine our role so that when we suspend, when we give over, when we surrender, is part of the planning process itself. Not execution, but a giving over to the people who are actually going to inhabit there to decide what they want to do. And that's, if I could only live another 50 years, that's what I would like to see more widespread.